Juste en temps.
Et bonjour.
On y va. Good afternoon. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Mon nom est Nadine Duguay-Lemay et je suis la présidente directrice générale de Dialogue Nouveau-Brunswick. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue à notre dialogue public sur le droit de vote des résidents permanents et ayant pour titre « Les votes perdus. Le Nouveau-Brunswick peut-il être un leader? » For those of you watching Facebook or via Facebook, please note that translation is not an available feature for the Facebook Live. It is, however, available within the webinar here today. J'ai le plaisir aujourd'hui d'animer à nouveau ce dialogue en compagnie de Sébastien Salazar, planificateur des politiques communautaires pour le secteur loisirs, culture et développement communautaire à la ville de Fredericton. Good afternoon, Sébastien.
Bonjour, Nadine. So, in acknowledgement that the land from which I am joining you is the traditional, unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoqiyik, Gola Sigolpen Wolastoko Nkitaki Mikomen Yutskat Gisi Milowewak. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which the Wolastoqiyik, the Mi'kmaq, and the Passamaquoddy peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties did not deal with surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. I am grateful that we can all virtually join here today, and grateful too for the First Peoples who share their ancestral homelands with us all. And I invite everyone to write in the chat from which unceded territory they are joining us today.
Merci beaucoup, Sébastien. On behalf of Dialogue New Brunswick, I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge our commitment to the struggle against systems of oppression that have resulted in profound inequities and against the denial of self-determination rights. We are working actively to deepen our learning at an individual level, provide learning opportunities about anti-racism and decolonization to the sector, and to develop partnership with organizations serving and led by underrepresented groups. J'aimerais maintenant partager avec vous quelques informations au sujet du fonctionnement cet après-midi. Tout d'abord, la traduction est disponible pour ceux et celles qui sont à l'intérieur du webinaire. Vous n'avez qu'à activer la fonction interprétation qui se trouve en bas de votre écran. Les directives sont mentionnées dans le clavardage ou comme on dit, dans le chat room. Comme ceci est un webinaire, il est normal que vous ne voyez que les panélistes et les animateurs. Vous pouvez participer activement tout au long du dialogue en commentant dans la fonction clavardage ou encore en écrivant votre question à l'aide de la fonction Q&A. Donc ça, c'est la foire aux questions. Il est possible de communiquer votre question à une personne spécifique ou encore à tous les panélistes. Ceci s'applique également dans la fonction clavardage, alors que vous pouvez choisir que tous les participants et panélistes voient votre commentaire ou seulement les panélistes. Et maintenant, je passe la parole à nouveau à mon co-animateur pour l'introduction des panélistes.
Merci, Nadine. So we are joined here today by leaders from our municipal associations, our private sector, academia, and government. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Dominic Cardy, Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development, Keith Chiasson, MLA for Tracadie, Dr. Aaron Crandall, Associate Professor in the Department of Politics at Acadia University, Krista Ross, CEO of the Fredericton Chamber of Commerce, Gaëtan Thomas, CEO of the Conseil économique du Nouveau-Brunswick, Alex Scholten, President of the Union of Municipalities of New Brunswick, and Michel Soucy, President of the Association francophone des Municipalités du Nouveau-Brunswick.
Bonjour Michel. Alors, je vous partage une citation d'Arthur Chen pour débuter ce qui nous guide chez Dialogue Nouveau-Brunswick et qui est très approprié pour le sujet d'aujourd'hui. La diversité, c'est un fait. L'équité est un choix. L'inclusion est une action et le sentiment d'appartenance est un résultat. Allow me to introduce the format of this dialogue today, in case this is the first time you join one of our dialogues. Le but de nos dialogues c'est toujours d'obtenir une meilleure compréhension sur un sujet et non d'atteindre la résolution. Si à la fin de ce dialogue, vous avez l'impression d'avoir appris quelque chose, notre mission est accomplie. Sachez également que nous publions des rapports sur chacun de nos dialogues et que ceux-ci sont partagés avec les parties prenantes et disponibles au public via notre site Web. D'ailleurs, je mentionne rapidement que les rapports publics pour partie 1 et 2 de ce sujet, Lost Votes, les votes perdus, est disponible maintenant sur notre site Web. En ce qui concerne le déroulement d'aujourd'hui, nous allons poser des questions aux panélistes afin qu'ils et elles puissent nous situer par rapport à leur positionnement sur le fait d'accorder le droit de vote aux résidents permanents et de parler des actions menées à date. Par la suite, nous aurons du temps pour répondre à quelques questions et nous entretenir avec les participants. En tout temps, par contre, les participants dans le webinaire peuvent se prévaloir de la fonctionnalité clavardage pour commenter. Je vous demanderai de respecter aussi les principes suivants qui s'appliquent ici dans le webinaire et aussi sur nos médias sociaux. Nous invitons chacun et chacune à faire preuve de respect et de courtoisie dans la publication de ces commentaires. Et les éléments suivants ne seront pas tolérés et seront systématiquement effacés. Les commentaires diffamatoires, abusifs et obscènes, les déclarations discriminatoires fondées notamment sur le sexe, la religion, la nationalité ou l'orientation sexuelle, et les propos incitant à la haine ou à la violence. À toi, Sébastien.
Merci, Nadine. Before that, I would like to apologize if you hear construction noise. That's right next to the crane and the trucks, everything. Yes. So this dialogue is a collaboration between Dialogue NB and the Fredericton Dialogue Community, a community group working on initiatives of social inclusion under the umbrella of Dialogue NB. The Fredericton Dialogue Community restarted the Lost Votes initiative last year with the involvement of many residents and partners. But for some quick background, I must mention that in 2014, Monsef Lacroix led a campaign to round up support from various municipalities in New Brunswick for a motion in favor of granting permanent residents the right to vote in municipal elections. At the time, many municipalities passed that motion. Later on, the New Brunswick Multicultural Council joined Monsef's efforts, and their advocacy resulted in a series of proposed municipal reforms under the Gaëtan government, but they were never implemented because there was an election soon after that resulted in a minority government. In August of last year, the Fredericton Dialogue Community, along with Dialogue NB and NBMC, continued what had been started around 5 years ago with an awareness campaign to shed light on the fact that in New Brunswick, this issue impacts 29,500 permanent residents who cannot vote. That's counting all working age adults, and that is still more than the population of Miramichi. Over the last 8 months, the momentum has grown province-wide as more municipalities, associations, and the public have signed a petition to grant the right to vote to permanent residents at the municipal level. As of today, the petition has received almost 200 signatures. In March, we held the first public dialogue to understand why amending the Municipal Elections Act is important to solve this issue of disenfranchisement of this particular group of Canadians in local matters that affect their daily lives. We also heard from subject matter expert Dr. Erin Crandall, who's here with us again today, and from the NB New Brunswick Multicultural Council about starting this initiative 5 years ago. But more importantly, we heard from permanent residents themselves about how this issue impacts or has impacted their lives. Our second public dialogue, held in April, brought together leaders from other jurisdictions across Canada who are also advocating for this change. It was the first time that these various individuals and groups were brought together to share information, best practices, and to support one another in what has become a sort of an informal coalition. Now, in today's third public dialogue, our goal is to share the information and perspectives collected to date during our last 2 dialogues on this important topic to help our decision makers move this file forward. We are all here to help the provincial government make this change a reality. So we thank you, Minister Cardy, and MLA Chiasson for attending this event and hearing about all the groundwork that has been done so far. Over to you, Nadine.
Merci beaucoup, Sébastien, pour cette mise en contexte. Donc, ma première question s'adresse à nos leaders de nos associations municipales qui sont Michel et Alex. Donc, je vais la poser en français, mais évidemment, vous la répondez dans la langue que vous voulez. Donc, peut-être, Michel, on va commencer avec vous. Pouvez-vous nous donner un bref aperçu du positionnement de votre association quant à accorder le droit de vote aux résidents permanents au niveau municipal et du pourquoi de ce positionnement? Est-ce que cela fait partie de la réforme municipale que vous proposez? Vous êtes sur mute, Michel.
Et voilà.
Et voilà.
Attendez, excusez-moi. Alors, merci premièrement pour la question, Nadine, et merci de me permettre de représenter l'Association francophone municipalisée du Nouveau-Brunswick à cette activité. Laissez-moi vous dire que l'association, nous parlons de ce sujet depuis plusieurs années. Je me rappelle, en 2013, on avait eu une discussion, une assemblée générale annuelle de l'association où est-ce que les membres avaient demandé qu'on se positionne et qu'on travaille avec les gouvernements provincial et fédéral afin de s'assurer qu'on pourrait mettre en place une façon d'améliorer au niveau de la croissance démographique et de voir de quelle façon qu'on pourrait permettre aux gens vraiment de s'impliquer dans nos communautés. Alors, en 2015, il y avait aussi une résolution qui avait été passée par le conseil d'administration du temps et par l'AGA qui avait déterminé que, regardez, il faut vraiment qu'on se positionne et qu'on appuie, qu'on travaille envers cette direction-là, de permettre aux résidents permanents d'avoir cette possibilité-là de voter. Si on veut être ouvert à l'immigration, si on veut démontrer qu'on est une terre d'accueil, je pense comme association, nous devons mettre de la pression et demander à nos gouvernements de mettre en place ces changements-là nécessaires afin de nous aider dans toutes les régions de la province. Et comme l'avait mentionné un petit peu plus tôt, Sébastien, il y a certaines municipalités qui avaient passé des résolutions, surtout dans les grandes villes, où est-ce qu'on avait appuyé cette démarche-là. Alors, l'Association francophone municipalité, c'est clair et précis que nous voulons voir et nous voulons franchir cette étape-là parce qu'on veut éventuellement faire partie de la solution au niveau de l'immigration et aussi au niveau de la participation des gens sur le côté démocratique de notre province et de nos municipalités. Maintenant, tu as posé la question, est-ce que ça fait partie au niveau de la réforme sur la gouvernance locale? Ma réponse est qu'on n'a pas eu de discussion à ce sujet-là parce qu'au niveau de la réforme présentement, on parle de gouvernance, on parle de collaboration régionale, on parle de l'urbanisme, on parle du financement, mais au niveau de savoir qui et quoi qui va avoir le droit de vote, c'est comme à part du sujet comme tel au sujet de la réforme qu'on est en train de parler présentement. Ça n'a jamais été vraiment apporté à la table, mais disons que c'est un autre, je pourrais dire un autre cheval de bataille qu'il faut avoir et parallèlement regarder à ce travail-là qui doit être accompli éventuellement.
Merci, Michel. Je vais peut-être revenir à vous rapidement, mais let's hear from Alex. So, same question with respect to UMNB. Oh, you're on mute as well.
Yep. Thanks, Nadine. First of all, I would like to express my appreciation for being able to take part in this panel. The topic of immigration and support for newcomers in the province is something that has been very important to me for my whole life. My father's family immigrated to Canada in 1952, and without the help of their community, they wouldn't have been able to succeed. So I appreciate the efforts here and the efforts to support newcomers to our province. The Union of Municipalities of New Brunswick represents 61 municipalities in the province. That is Francophone and Anglophone municipalities, rural and urban municipalities. And the purpose of our association is really to advocate on behalf of those municipalities with our provincial government and with our federal government as well. So one of the issues that we have taken on in the past is the lost votes focus. Each year, our membership comes together in an AGM, and we pass resolutions that our members bring to the table in terms of what they believe are important issues for us to focus on. In October 2015, our AGM, we had a resolution from the floor after a presentation that was made by Alex LeBlanc of the New Brunswick Multicultural Council to support the request of the Multicultural Council for inclusion of permanent residents being able to vote in municipal elections. That motion was passed by our members. As Sebastian, I think, noted previously, unfortunately, that issue seemed to go cold for a few years as well, and our membership hadn't discussed it again until February 20th of this year, where in a board meeting, we also brought forward the same resolution and looked for support from our board members. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do that with our AGM last year due to the pandemic. Our AGM was changed slightly, where we weren't able to do that in person. But with the board meeting, we did have a very fulsome discussion on the matter. And again, the motion to support the inclusion of permanent residents in voting in municipal elections was brought forward and was approved once again unanimously. So I would say in terms of our organization, this is something that is very much supported across the province with our 61 municipalities. You get a very good representation of municipalities in all corners of the province. In the discussions that preceded that resolution, the positive aspects of this, or the reason for the support of this, included what we know to be the importance of immigration in New Brunswick. Anything that we can do to support immigration is going to help us attract, support and retain newcomers to this province. And we know how important that's going to be to our economy, and our way of life here in New Brunswick. We also discussed the importance of the taxation without representation issue. With newcomers coming here, not having the ability, paying taxes, paying property taxes, paying other taxes, and not being able to vote, that's not really a thing that our democracy tolerates. This is something that we want to make sure that people have the right to do. I would also say that allowing newcomers to vote in elections could help us create municipal councils that are far more representative of their communities. At the present time, this past election, we once again saw very, very low voter turnout. And I think part of that reason is that oftentimes our councils aren't seen as being representative of the community they represent. And not allowing permanent residents the opportunity to vote and thereby have the ability to run for council as well, because our Elections Act allows for that, I think is something that would potentially help us raise voter turnout in our elections. Related to that as well is the fact that in many ridings, wards, in many communities, council or people that ran in the election were uncontested. There was a lot of acclamations this election, which again, I think is something that could be positively impacted by allowing permanent residents the ability to vote and to run in those elections. So I would say that if we want to support immigration, and this comes from our municipal association, what we agreed on is that if we want to support immigration, if we want to attract newcomers to this province, anything we can do that makes this province more favorable to them is going to be beneficial in our attraction and our retention efforts. So I would raise that in terms of my municipal involvement. I also am on this call with my company's logo on my chest. I didn't necessarily do that on purpose, but it's there. We'll leave it at that. But I also am part owner of a business in New Brunswick or in Fredericton that benefits significantly from newcomers in my community. The face of our customers is changing as we bring in more newcomers to the province. It's important for my business to also reflect that in my staff who I employ. So we have a multicultural staff as well. I work closely with the Multicultural Association in Fredericton whenever I have a position open. We want to make sure that we're representative of the customers that we are benefiting from. So in that respect, I would say selfishly, from my own personal perspective, supporting this helps my business. Supporting this initiative will help employment, will help the economy here in the province. So thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Seb, if you allow me just 2 minutes, I just want to know, or I want to frame the discussion very quickly around something that Michel said earlier, and it's about the reform, right? The proposed reform to local governance. Because you said it's un cheval de bataille, right? And so I guess there are two ways to look at this. Est-ce que c'est plus facile de soit on choisit qu'est-ce qui est absolument prioritaire et qu'on aimerait qu'il passe, ou est-ce qu'on pourrait pas le regarder de l'autre façon qui est, ben, tant qu'à faire une réforme, on fait tout en même temps? Juste, qu'est-ce que vous pensez?
Parce que je ne veux pas répondre en tant que politicien, mais ce que je regarde aux deux, c'est que les deux, ça provient de deux lois différentes. Alors, il y a la loi sur la gouvernance locale et aussi la loi au niveau élection, au niveau des élections. Alors, alors c'est deux dossiers qui ne se réduisent pas, à moins que mes politiciens qui sont là à la table disent autrement. Mais c'est ça. Alors, c'est pour ça que je dis il y a deux endroits où est-ce qu'on peut travailler en parallèle, mais faire avancer le dossier pareil. Je pense que pour nous, l'association, il est clair qu'on veut une réforme municipale, on veut qu'il y ait une restructuration, que ce soit au niveau de la gouvernance, de la fiscalité, au niveau de tout ce qui a rapport avec la régionalisation et tout ça. Mais en même temps, on appuie, on veut faire avancer ce dossier-là au niveau de nos résidents permanents. En fait, c'est pour ça que je dis qu'il y a deux champs de bataille.
Okay, merci beaucoup de le rappeler, de le préciser. Alex, did you want to add anything to that?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just asking if you had anything to add to what Michel just said. Basically, bring it back to there's two acts, right? So.
Yeah. No, I think Michel has covered that very well. The local reform, local governance reform that we've seen right now is addressing local governance issues. On the election side of things, under the Elections Act, it's seen as somewhat different in terms of that. So I don't believe that has been addressed through reform at this point.
Okay. Merci beaucoup. Thank you both.
We will now turn it over to Krista and Gaëtan to hear the viewpoint of the private sector on this matter. So Krista, we'll start with you. As we have seen, you have been very outspoken on this issue. Just recently, you have written an article published in Huddle Today that explicitly talked about the importance of enabling permanent residents to vote due to their contribution to our economy. Can you tell us what your members, along with your counterparts across the province, think about this issue, and perhaps talk about actions led to date to help our province make this a reality? Krista.
Thanks very much. First of all, for the opportunity to be here, representing the business community and to speak on this important issue. I'm going to start with a little background just to give you some context as to how we got involved in the Lost Votes initiative. The Chamber's efforts to support newcomers actually started in 2009. We launched the Business Immigrant Mentorship Program, and Alex Scholten actually was one of our original mentors. We matched entrepreneurial newcomers with seasoned local business people to provide guidance on how to do business and live here in Fredericton and in Canada. A few years later, we launched The Hive, which was a business incubator that was specifically for newcomers, and it was located in Planet Hatch. And we also put together a program called Succession Connect, and that was to match local business owners looking to sell with newcomers looking to buy businesses. So we ran those programs until 2019, and the community of Fredericton came together to create a new immigration strategy. So as part of the strategy, the Chamber was identified as the organization that would be responsible for immigration advocacy. So this actually led to some big decisions for us. First of all, we ported over our programs to Ignite Fredericton. They're responsible for programming and related supports within the immigration strategy. And second, we created a dedicated immigration advocacy committee. It's made up of a mix of newcomers, business owners, association representative, and others who are interested in this topic. So this allowed us to do what I guess we think we're good at, which is being an advocate. And programming is what Ignite excels at. And it's led to better support, we think, for newcomers. Under the strategy, of course, MCAF continues to be responsible for the settlement services for newcomers. So our chamber represents more than 1,000 businesses and not-for-profit organizations. And we've also brought our immigration advocacy to the national stage. Each year we go to the Canadian Chamber with policy resolutions. Local chambers from across the country can submit resolutions that ask the federal government to do something. And if we get the support of chambers from across the country, it becomes part of the Canadian Chamber's advocacy work. Currently, we have a resolution on the books that relates to accelerating the startup visa program. And we also have one which is about attracting and retaining international students through Canadian work experience. So this is a topic that's near and dear to our hearts. So having given you a little bit of background, I'll tell you about our most recent work. It was through our Immigration Advocacy Committee that we first learned about the Lost Votes movement, and that was through Asif Hassan. Asif was the co-chair with Alex of the immigration strategy for our community. He's been a leader in this movement, and it's something that he feels very strongly and passionately about, and many of us know him. His enthusiasm and his passion is absolutely infectious. He connected us with the larger group, and we were really impressed with the momentum that had already been built up in a real sort of organic grassroots movement. So in December of last year, we wrote to Minister Elaine, and we followed that up in a meeting with the Regional Caucus for Fredericton in early January. We also looped in other business associations. We did a second letter to demonstrate an even broader support. So we had Ignite Fredericton, Downtown Fredericton Inc., and Business Fredericton North, and they signed on to support this effort. And it's also become one of the topics that we bring up to elected officials pretty much whenever the opportunity arises. And it seems as if the people that we've talked to certainly aren't opposed to the idea, but they certainly want to think it through and make sure that there aren't any unintended consequences of this. For some, it's a new idea. So the more that we talk about it and the more that we normalize the idea, the better. So taking on and championing this within the business community, we feel was a natural fit for the chamber. And we feel that making changes to the Municipal Elections Act to allow permanent residents to vote really takes us past talking the talk, and it makes us walk the walk. It really sends a clear message that New Brunswick welcomes newcomers with more than just our words. We welcome them with our actions and with our respect. Many of our permanent residents are really anxious to participate in every facet of life, including political life. And they would really appreciate having their adopted province being the first one in Canada to show this sign of respect and welcome. It's important to note that they add tremendous value to our community. We see it from an entrepreneurial lens or a business lens. They create jobs, they pay taxes, they enhance our cultural life. And extending this right would really enhance our reputation as a highly desirable location for immigrants. And even when we look at the province's population growth action plan, the 4 objectives of that plan are to attract a skilled workforce that aligns with labor market needs, to recruit entrepreneurs that encourage sustainable economic growth, to create an environment where newcomers and their families can settle and succeed, and to engage communities to foster a more diverse and welcoming province. And we really believe that giving permanent residents the opportunity to vote in municipal elections would achieve those objectives. So that's why the Fredericton Chamber of Commerce got involved in this issue. And we continue to advocate on every opportunity that we have.
Thank you, Krista. And I would like to add also that it would also send the message that we're also giving them the trust to help them decide on matters, on local matters,
Absolutely.
such as, for example, our public transportation, our water and sewer, our roads and streets, our recreation facilities, lots of the things that have to do with our day-to-day lives. Right?
And things that their taxes are paying for.
And their taxes are paying for, yes. Thank you. So, Gaëtan, est-ce que tu partages l'opinion à Krista? Comment les membres du Conseil économique du Nouveau-Brunswick sont positionnés sur la question d'accorder le droit de vote aux résidents permanents et quelles actions avez-vous menées à date?
Bon, ben, premièrement, je suis complètement d'accord avec Krista, sans même avoir entendu ce qu'elle avait dit avant. Completely on board with you, Krista. Puis, moi, j'aimerais apporter, il y a trois angles de ceci. Le premier angle, il y a le côté moral, il y a le côté, tu sais, the right thing to do. Is this the right thing to do? And obviously, the answer is yes. Okay. Le côté politique, parce que j'en parle un petit peu après ça. Puis après ça, il y a le côté économique. And when you can check those three items, morality, politics, and economics, generally, this should already be done. Il y a pas d'hésitation dans mon esprit que ceci aurait déjà dû avoir lieu. On a manqué une opportunité dans les élections passées où est-ce qu'on a de la population, puis on est ici, ça fait longtemps, puis on prend notre droit de vote comme acquis. On y va, moins de 1 sur 3 ont été votés. Alors, we take our democracy, for granted. And then we have 29,000 people here that are part of our livelihood, that we need, that we love to have around us. And we say, democracy is not in your hands. So from a morality point of view, it's easy to see that this is unfair. It's just unfair. And Canada, to be the leader in the world, to be the best country in the world, that we won, according to some US magazine, #1 country to live in the world, has to really play the angle of this high morality. And obviously, I'm just going to take a little side here, but also with respect to First Nation. Until we fully reconcile with First Nation, sincerely, genuinely, this country cannot say that we are the best country in the world, because we would not accept that on the morality level. So my position on First Nation, by the way, they're the only non-immigrants. We're all immigrants. We came from somewhere else except First Nation. So they were here before us, and their rights should be obviously preserved, and we should reconcile, and we should grow this country. Well, for the immigrants to come here in this country, they have to have the sense of belonging, le sentiment d'appartenance. Et ce sentiment-là, ça se gagne pas seulement par le côté économique, ça se gagne par le côté politique. Et l'angle politique que je veux amener ce point-ci, it's the political angle is that the right to vote, the right to participate, when decisions are made, they're part of us, they're part of our country. And if the government doesn't really do the right decisions, whether it's municipal or provincial, they have the right to boot them out too. So to me, it's fundamental from both la moralité et la politique. The economic, now let's think about the economic here, okay? We have a strategy, and both provincial governments that I dealt with in the last 10 years while I was with NB Power, we're talking about 10,000 immigrants a year. And we're talking 100,000 immigrants in 10 years. Let's imagine if today we said, you can vote, the first province in the country. Let's say that our friend Keith and Dominic Cardy here could make that happen with a unanimous proposition in the House. So that's the challenge I have for my friends Keith and Dominic today. You know, if they could make that happen, you know, just like historically, and we'd be the first. Imagine what it would do towards that 10,000 a year. And now I'm going to put my economic hat au nom du Conseil économique du Nouveau-Brunswick. If we are successful with 60,000 people, the economist David Campbell said that we would have 25,000 new workers in New Brunswick, and that will raise our GDP by 1.7 billion, and also bring 271 more million to be divided between the issues that Michel, Soucy have to face with the local governance. How do we spread the wealth? And the provincial government, they would have an extra $271 million a year. So from an economic point of view, it makes a lot of sense. And then David Campbell also wrote, and on the economic side, that, you know, we've lost more than 11,007 self-employed people in the last 10 years. And during the pandemic, we lost 4,000. 4,000 de moins des employeurs qui travaillaient à leur propre compte. Okay? So 11 in 10 years. That last decade, we've lost that sense of entrepreneurship in New Brunswick. Well, these immigrants come here, they want to start a new life. There's a lot of business to be sold, and there's nobody to buy them. So this aging population, especially in rural New Brunswick, 11,000. If we were able to go back to where we were with the self-employed, average of 3 people, let's say 10,000, let's make it easy for people. Every business average would be 3 more people, so that's 30,000 people. But then there's all kinds of indirects with the self-employment. Instead of having businesses going and, you know, like, you know, we hear about, you know, accountants and lawyers and really becoming part of a national group of big firm where money gets out of this province, head office are outside this province. But if we had these people working here, competing here, the benefit would be actually $5.9 billion. So if we can convince half those immigrants to actually take on businesses, existing businesses that are looking for new owners, we would actually bring another $6 billion in the economy. So, and imagine what that would do. So from a political angle, from a morality angle, from an economic angle, it's yes, 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 oui. Alors, le Conseil économique est complètement d'accord avec la position. Moi, je suis relativement nouveau. I didn't do as much action as what Krista did and my colleagues here, but I can tell you that I will be the biggest champion for this because New Brunswick need it done. We need to really get this right. And the sooner the better. So my challenge to Keith and Dominic are still on the table. And if you need my help, please, I will write anything you want me to write. I will go on the social media. I will write articles. I have an article every week at the Acadie Nouvelle. And Sébastien and Nadine feed me some stuff and I will publish it. So merci. Complètement à bord avec la position du groupe ici. Totally on board.
Super. Merci beaucoup, Gaëtan. Puis je veux reconnaître que toi, tu dois quitter à 15 heures, n'est-ce pas? Donc, je t'invite, on va aller à Dr. Crandall, mais si jamais, après Dr. Crandall, tu veux intervenir de nouveau, je vais retourner à toi pour que tu puisses dire un autre petit mot avant que tu quittes. Ça marche? OK. Alors, Dr. Crandall, c'est un plaisir de vous avoir à nouveau sur cette question. Puis surtout, à titre de politologue, votre expertise est grandement appréciée. Donc, est-ce que vous pourriez nous résumer rapidement le point de vue que vous avez partagé sur la question en mars dernier lors de notre premier dialogue et peut-être aussi élaborer sur les défis que vous avez entendus être véhiculés et comment proposez-vous de les surmonter? Dr. Crandall.
Thank you very much for having me back. So I'll talk a bit about voting from a rights perspective. So when I spoke in March, I discussed the guarantee of the right of Canadian citizens to vote in federal and provincial elections that is protected by Section 3 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so while the Charter does not guarantee voting rights to non-citizens, including permanent residents, Section 3 court cases, Supreme Court decisions, can help us to identify reasons why the participation of permanent residents in municipal elections can strengthen democracy in New Brunswick and across Canada. So the most recent voting rights case heard by the Supreme Court was in 2019, and it dealt with expatriate voting, so Canadian citizens who are living abroad. And in the past, expats who lived for more than 5 years outside of Canada were barred from voting in federal elections. And in this decision, Frank v. Canada, the Supreme Court ruled that this restriction on expat voting rights was unconstitutional. And so now all Canadian citizens, regardless of where they reside in Canada or outside of Canada, can vote in federal elections. So for our discussion, the defense of the law put forward by the federal government is interesting. So the federal government came before the Supreme Court to defend this law that limited voting rights. And the federal government argued that in order to preserve the social contract between citizens in the state, only those who are subject to Canadian law on a daily basis, so those who lived in Canada, should have the right to participate in the law-making process through voting. So if we apply this rationale to permanent residents who live in Canada are affected by Canadian laws on a day-to-day basis and have made a legal commitment as permanent residents to be part of Canadian society. By the federal government's argument before the Supreme Court, it is such people who are entitled to vote. In fact, they are so entitled to vote that the federal government argued that Canadian citizens who do not live in Canada should lose that right, arguably the most fundamental right to any democracy. So what can we take from this? So Section 3 of the Charter does not provide us a constitutional pathway for voting rights for permanent residents. We can't go to the courts and force governments to allow permanent residents to vote via the Charter. But it does provide us a way of thinking about why enfranchising permanent residents is consistent with Canada's democratic values. And certainly there are no constitutional barriers that are stopping New Brunswick from making this important change. So there are no constitutional barriers. Really, the challenges that we're talking about are political. So in terms of current challenges to make this change possible, to oversimplify, the government simply needs to do it. It's an issue of political will and leadership. And I'll simply add that when we look at the history of the franchise in Canada or globally, there are no examples of a person wrongly given the right to vote. Expanding the franchise is always good for democracy, and it will be good for New Brunswick to expand its franchise to allow permanent residents to vote in municipalities. So from a rights perspective, it is all good. And from a political perspective, it should be all good as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crandall, for that great summary. I'm sure we're going to get into the crux of it after we've heard from everyone, but that really positions, if you will, the argument, because we have heard that over and over. It's a charter thing. It's unconstitutional. It's anyways, and therefore, je pense en français. I'm sorry. I'm thinking that contextualizing it with an actual case, and this was actually, we've heard this said in the second dialogue as well from a lawyer in BC who echoed those sentiment that yes, this 2019 Supreme Court ruling actually should open the pathway for permanent residents receiving the right to vote, especially at municipal level at least.
Yeah, and I'll just add, when you think about the charter, those rights are rights that speak to things that a government cannot impose upon you. They protect you from government actions that are unlawful. So certainly the charter should never be used as an argument that we cannot do something to give someone a right. That's not the design or the intention of the charter. So it doesn't present any constitutional or legal barriers.
Thank you, Dr. Crandall. Gaëtan, est-ce que tu voulais ajouter quelque chose?
Ben, simplement que je m'attendais qu'il y avait plus de roadblocks. There was more roadblocks than, so thank you, Dr. Crandall, to actually, it doesn't sound as hard at all. I had, some other issues that, when you make a decision, there's unintended consequences, but really that road is not there. So at the end of the day, my only conclusion then, it's about political will, it's about leadership. And I'm glad to see that all the business associations, all the, the academics are supporting it, and all the municipalities are supporting after hearing Alex and Michel. So for me, it's, we just got to get our folks in Fredericton to move a little faster. Encore une petite pointe à M. Cardy et M. Chiasson, mais on comprend qu'il y a d'autres priorités. Mais je veux réemphaser que sans l'immigration, sans cette différenciation qu'on a au Nouveau-Brunswick, on ne pourra pas relever notre économie. Alors, when government says that economic recovery is the most important thing, it cannot be done without immigration. And this is one of the levers that can actually give us an edge, a winning edge across the country.
Merci beaucoup, Gaëtan. Sébastien, on continue et on s'en va.
Merci.
Oui.
And just to add, when you mentioned the second public dialogue, it's all online. You can see them all. And there's a part that Joe from Ontario mentioned, and it was something along the lines of, is it a matter of citizenship to comment and decide on issues of better buses and recycling and garbage and policing, or is it a matter of residency? Right? And I remember how he said it. It's there if you want to read it, because he said it much better than I did, but that was his point. So let's conclude the round of perspectives with two elected officials who have been actively participating on this file. Monsieur Chiasson, MLA Chiasson, nous allons commencer avec vous. Comme il a été mentionné au tout début, vous avez présenté en décembre dernier le projet de loi 28 visant à modifier la loi sur les élections municipales. Ce projet de loi a été présenté comme le dernier point à l'ordre du jour lors de la dernière journée de l'Assemblée législative et il a été reporté en vue d'une discussion plus approfondie. Lorsque l'Assemblée législative a repris sa session en février, cette discussion n'a pas eu lieu. Pouvez-vous nous dire quelle était votre compréhension de prochaine étape et ce qui s'est passé à votre connaissance?
Bonjour, merci beaucoup Sébastien, puis bonjour aux panélistes. Je suis vraiment content dans le fond de faire partie de cette discussion. Belle façon de finir la semaine. So Gaëtan, to your point, politicians are listening. As Sébastien mentioned, as critic for the official opposition for local government and municipal reform. So I did bring forward a bill just before Christmas to bring changes to the Election Act that would give permanent residents the right to vote during municipal elections. And it was actually quite an easy bill because all it mentioned was that it was adding the word permanent resident after Canadian citizen in the bill, in the act. So the reason why we did bring it forward in December was that it was our last sitting day. And obviously because of the elections, the municipal elections that were looming in May, we wanted to bring that forward as quickly as possible and hopefully have unanimous consent to be able to bring it to third reading and maybe get it to have royal assent in order to give Election New Brunswick time to be able to work on the voters list and have this in place before the municipal election. That didn't happen. I think there were concerns on the part of Election New Brunswick that putting together a voters list in such a short period of time would have been a little bit complicated. We still kind of wanted this to go forward because obviously, when you want to bring change, sometimes you need a starting point. So we kind of wanted to force things and say, okay, well, listen, let's get this bill passed, and then we'll all hands on deck to try to get this, the logistics in place before the month of May. So it didn't happen. And what happens is, just to talk about a little bit of procedure of the way it works. So opposition, so this would fall under the category of a private member public bill. And in the Legislative Assembly, we only have 1 day a week where oppositions could actually debate public member bills. So because of the pandemic and because of the fact that we weren't sitting as many days as usual, you could just imagine that the opposition days are far from between. So our target was obviously to push this forward in order to get it before May. And seeing as we weren't going to be able to meet this target, we said, okay, well, listen, let's address other matters in the time being, and then we'll come back to this and then make sure we have it in place for the next municipal election. Now, because of the reform, the municipal reform being talked about, and there's going to be changes to local governance in the province, we might have elections sooner than later, maybe depending on what government decides. So I think we need to address this as quickly as possible. I think there is political will. Obviously, my colleague and the minister will talk on this, but for us, when we brought this forward, so for me, before, just to back up a little bit, so before I came into politics, I was more in the community field. And I did work for a settlement agency in my region, donc le CAENA, le Comité d'accueil pour les nouveaux arrivants. Donc je suis très content, dans le fond, d'entendre, peu importe le secteur, que ce soit le secteur privé ou les municipalités, de reconnaître l'importance de la contribution des résidents permanents dans leur région. Donc, quand nous, on a mis le projet de loi de l'avant, ça a été comme, comment ça se fait dans le fond, un peu comme Gaëtan l'a mentionné, comment ça se fait qu'on n'a pas réagi ou qu'on n'a pas mis ça en place avant. Donc, ça a été une surprise pour nous qu'il n'y a aucune province au Canada qui ont donné ou qui ont accordé le droit de vote aux résidents permanents. Donc, on a vraiment la chance d'être les premiers au Canada, de pouvoir mettre ça en vigueur. Puis, je pense que c'est doublement important pour la province du Nouveau-Brunswick parce que nous sommes une des provinces avec une population vieillissante. Donc, l'âge est assez élevé ici dans la province. Puis, la stratégie, the growth strategy for New Brunswick is even more important because we do have an aging population. And we do have to, in order to finance the social programs and to deliver services that, government needs to deliver, we need people paying taxes. So we need more residents here in the province. And what better way to welcome, to make people, newcomers feel welcome than to have them participate in, municipal life and in the decisions that are being made in their communities. So for us, it's very important. We are planning on bringing it forward. I'm going to end on this. So the way it's going to work, so it went through first reading. So the first reading in the Legislative Assembly is where you bring forward the bill. So that's been done. We're now at the stage of second reading, and that's where there's a debate on the floor of the Legislative Assembly where different parties will kind of chime in and give their opinion on that. And there's a vote at the end of the second reading. And after second reading, usually the bills go to committee. So it could be committee of the whole, it could be political, economic policy committee, or it could be law amendment committee. So that's got to be voted. And obviously, because we're in opposition, we need the collaboration of government to get this bill to committee. Once it gets to committee, then obviously we could kind of question and kind of just work out the nuts and bolts of the bill. So if there are any issues, committee will actually address that. And then committee must vote in favor of bringing it back to the House for third reading. And then again, at third reading, there's that final vote, and then it can move on and get royal assent. So we do need collaboration. So je tends ma main au gouvernement pour nous donner un coup de main avec ce projet de loi. For us, it's not a question of who passes a bill. It's not a question about getting recognition. It's really a question about getting this done. And whether it's government, opposition, or third parties, I think it's good for the province, and if we could work together on this and get this done, then everybody wins.
C'est super. Monsieur Chiasson, on pourra peut-être revenir tantôt sur ce qu'on a entendu des autres provinces et territoires, justement sur la question de pourquoi c'est pas encore arrivé là-bas.
Oui, merci.
Oui. Alors, OK, nous allons tourner maintenant à ministre Cardy. Donc, nous savons, bonjour tout d'abord, puis bienvenue à nouveau à l'un de nos dialogues. Merci beaucoup pour votre présence. Nous savons que vous avez tenu une réunion en janvier dernier avec un certain nombre de parties prenantes sur ce sujet, y compris Mme Krista et aussi Asif Hassan. Pouvez-vous nous dire si le gouvernement a pris officiellement position sur cette question et quelles sont les principales préoccupations auxquelles nous pouvons contribuer à répondre?
Merci bien, Nadine, et merci pour l'opportunité pour être ici avec tout le monde. Je pense absolument que c'est une question vraiment importante. Et c'est primordial, en effet, parce qu'on discute les questions qui sont au cœur des discussions d'une démocratie. C'est qui a le droit d'être un citoyen, qui a le droit de participer dans le processus démocratique, etc. So I'm making these remarks not representing the government, but as an MLA, and also having had years working on democracy promotion efforts around the world, and believing it's about the most important thing that anyone can do is to try and strengthen engagement in democracy and active citizenship. So I know it's gone out of style, but I'm proud to say I'm a globalist. I want to see the erosion of national frontiers as much as possible. I want to see the same liberalization of capital that we've seen over the last number of decades added to with the free movement of peoples as much as possible. That said, right now, we're clearly facing a pretty different world than the one we were back in the sort of the high point of that international move towards democracy and global openness, probably peaked in about 20 years ago now. And we're seeing a substantial rollback, not just as non-democratic countries get stronger, but as democracies get weaker. So I'm going to be a contrary voice in this. I started off being very strongly in favor of this idea. And I remember back, I think I saw that Professor O'Byrne wrote in the column on the side about how we used to have the right for permanent residents to vote, especially for Commonwealth countries. And it was gotten rid of for reasons that I'm also not aware of the exact details. But I remember thinking that was sad at the time, that it makes sense for all the reasons the panelists have described, to open up our province to different voices, to make people feel engaged and want to become citizens. Why not be different, be more open? But I think first off, we've got to be careful the way we have this argument and this conversation, because this is not about disenfranchisement, because as various folks have pointed out, the right to vote is held by citizens right now. And that's the international definition of it. It's the one that's held up by the United Nations as well. And in Canada, we're in an incredibly privileged position where our passport allows us to travel around the world, once we're allowed to do that again, without any restrictions in many cases. Dozens, well over 100 countries where we don't even need visas. We can just arrive, show our passport, and we go. That is not the same for many countries. We have an idea of citizenship as well that's inclusive and multicultural, and that's one of the gifts that I think Canada has brought to the world, of a different way of imagining nationality and citizenship as an idea around a more inclusive nationalism based not on ethnicity or race or language even, but around values and ideas. So it's a set of civic nationalist principles, which have made our country really strong, led us to be in the privileged position we're in the world. Many countries do not act that way. And for many countries, citizenship is a tool that is used to harass, abuse, and intimidate their citizens, whether they're residing in the territory of that nation state or whether they've traveled overseas. And my reasons for having moved from being a strong supporter of this idea to being concerned about it rest on that fact, and on the fact that since Bill 28 was introduced, and I applaud Mr. Chiasson for having done it, so I think this is an incredibly important discussion, regardless of where we end up with it. And the government has not taken a position on it, and I know there are caucus members in government who are strongly in favor of the bill. So this is by no means, I'm not speaking on behalf again of the government or the PC caucus, but my concerns are, first off, we've talked a lot about economic benefits. I'm just going to put that to one side, because I also have not seen any evidence that extending citizenship rights would help in that particular area. So being a data-driven guy, if there's evidence out there, I went to look for it and couldn't really find it. That absolutely increased access to every other layer of government services Medicare, access to the school system where we're pretty good. We should move ahead in those areas. And I think we should, as a province, pressure Ottawa to allow more open immigration to New Brunswick so that we can increase our population as quickly as possible. But when it comes to extending voting rights to PR, I received emails after I initially raised some questions about this, I think in a couple of Facebook posts, from citizens of China, Russia, Egypt, Algeria, and a couple of other countries who asked me to speak out strongly against this bill. And the arguments that they presented were, I'm going to use the most eloquent letter from a group of Chinese citizens who finished their letter, which I've got in front of me here, saying, finally, we need to remain anonymous because we are afraid of the consequences if the United Front, which is a part of the Chinese Communist Party, knows we are opposing this bill. So these are people who are permanent residents, who are making their home here in New Brunswick, and are afraid that, influenced by their home countries, the country to which they still hold a passport, the legal system to which they are still accountable as long as they hold that passport, and who in many cases have strong family and community connections to those countries, that they will see those people abused and their rights be placed at risk here in New Brunswick. And there's a long list of evidence supporting this that I don't think has received enough attention in this discussion. That there have been multiple instances, and this is all documented by our own national intelligence services and in the open press. And you can easily go and access this, and if anyone's interested, I'll get the links, of folks saying that they have been specifically targeted by their home country, encouraging them to get involved in federal, provincial, and municipal elections to pursue the foreign policy goals of the countries to which they still owe an oath of allegiance, something which sounds really old-fashioned, but it still means an enormous amount in many places in the world. And those have included express, direct threats that have been followed up upon to exact retribution against people back in their home countries if they don't take those actions here in Canada to do as that foreign government bids them. So I think that this is something where, if we're talking about making people feel included, to use another line from another one of the emails, and saying, I want to become a citizen of Canada as quickly as possible, precisely because the country in which I was born will victimize, intimidate, and harass me to the ends of the earth. Canada would never do that. That's why I love my adopted country, and I can't wait to take the oath to become a citizen and enjoy the full rights of a Canadian. So there are people like that in New Brunswick who are afraid to be part of this conversation. And I think that we have to be very careful about ignoring their voices. And they're not going to come and speak before our legislative committee because they do not have the protection that our government offers. As imperfect as it is, and we've talked about the crimes that our country has committed in its history, and those are real. But for a lot of other folks around the world, they come here to avoid and escape the governments that have treated them and their families terribly. And I think we've got to listen to them. So if we're going to talk about something concrete to do, and Gaëtan talked about, let's work on real reconciliation with our First Nations. Let's work on welcoming new immigrants by making sure that work like the work that Dialogue does to encourage newcomers to arrive here so they feel welcomed. And then they want to take that citizenship course, they want to take that oath, and they want to become Canadians, and they can become part of a country that's doing its best to stand up for the values that even allow us to have this conversation against a large number of other countries and a growing number of other countries that are actively hostile to principles of liberalism, small L liberalism, democracy, and a rule-based international order. So I think that 20 years ago, I would have had no arguments against this bill on any grounds. Today, it concerns me, and unless I have those questions that I've just raised addressed, I would be very concerned about supporting this bill, especially in light of elections in New Brunswick having continued to have some difficulties in their operationalization of elections, to be polite about it, and the fact that you can make unlimited, unaccounted for donations to New Brunswick political parties at the provincial level, not unlimited at the provincial level, but from anywhere in the world. And at the municipal level, there's no accountability for them at all. So you can have someone who is a resident in a foreign country making significant donations without limits to a New Brunswick municipal election campaign. So that's the sort of thing that if we're going to pursue this, even with my other reservations, we'd have to make fixes on those lines, because I don't think anyone here would support having foreign money influencing New Brunswick's municipal elections. And that would be a definite risk. It's already happened elsewhere if we started to allow folks who are still loyal, whether they want to be or not, to a foreign country to vote in our elections at whatever level.
Ben, merci beaucoup, ministre Cardy. Puis, merci aussi pour partager votre perspective. C'est pour ça qu'on a le dialogue. Je pense que c'est important de ne pas toujours juste avoir les perspectives qui sont pro. Hein? On veut les entendre et ça prend du courage pour les dire. Donc, au moins, c'est sur la table. Puis, voyons ce qu'on peut les adresser. Est-ce que le panel aurait des choses à ajouter ou à partager? Je vais peut-être me tourner par Dr. Crandall en premier, si vous voulez renchérir sur, ou vous avez des argumentaires à donner envers ce qu'on a entendu.
Sure. Yeah. So I was, very interested in listening to what Minister Cardy had to say. I'm not sure what the triggering mechanism is, or the distinction is between being a permanent resident and being unduly influenced by your country of birth versus being a dual citizen, a Canadian citizen, and being unduly influenced by your country of birth. In terms of your rights as a permanent resident, you are, as secure in Canada as you are as a Canadian citizen. And so I think I'm missing the part where somebody would be more at risk of voting as a permanent resident, which I think you were alluding to, voting security concerns. And I don't necessarily see that as being a concern, although I do appreciate that you were receiving that information from residents and you were expressing their views. But if maybe you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Sure. As permanent residents, they are not protected by Canadian law. If a permanent resident of Canada returns, let's to use an example that's appropriate because it's certainly the bulk of the correspondence I received and seems to be the country that is most engaged in trying to influence their expatriate community to interfere in foreign countries' elections, which would be China. Russia would be a close second, although they seem to focus more on the US. So if I am a citizen of China and I'm living in New Brunswick without the protections of Canadian law that come from Canadian citizenship, anytime I leave Canada, I am open to being, and this is, we're not talking about this, these are no longer abstract questions, and we have Canadian citizens who are imprisoned as political pawns in Russia, in China right now. So this is not abstract. Those folks are under no protection from Canada. Whereas once they become a Canadian citizen, even with the many countries that allow dual citizenship, Canada at least has rights to be able to help those people out. So here they are actually exposed as people who, again, have a loyalty to another country, whether they want to have that loyalty or not. And that country has a tie and a claim over them. So that's an enormous difference. So unless you're willing to never leave the boundaries of Canada again as a permanent resident, it's an absolutely fundamental distinction. Because becoming a Canadian citizen offers you protections of the Canadian government and Canadian law. Those don't exist for permanent residents.
Ministre Cardy, on demande dans le chat, ça fait quelques reprises, on aimerait que vous puissiez partager les liens à laquelle vous avez parlé. Si vous pouvez le faire avant la fin du webinaire, ça serait très apprécié.
Possiblement pas avant la fin, mais je vais les envoyer juste après. J'avais un document un de mes adjoints a écrit pour moi qui donne les citations, etc. sur le dossier.
OK, excellent. Est-ce qu'on pourra ajouter ça au rapport aussi?
Absolument.
OK, excellent. Donc, il y a plusieurs mains levées. On va commencer avec Michel Soucy. Vous vouliez renchérir?
Oui, bonjour. Oui, c'est concernant le point que le ministre Cardy a apporté concernant la contribution des gens d'affaires ou des gens de l'extérieur concernant les élections municipales. Et je suis d'accord que nous devons faire et mettre en place, par l'entremise de la loi sur les élections municipales, vraiment un plafond au niveau d'investissement ou d'aide à des candidats possibles à l'intérieur de l'élection. Qu'on provienne de l'extérieur ou qu'on provienne de nos municipalités respectives, présentement, ça existe. Ça existe pas de l'argent qui vient de l'extérieur, mais de gens qui veulent avoir de l'influence au niveau de la politique municipale par rapport à des contrats possiblement, et puis il n'y a pas de limite. Alors, je pense que il faut faire ce changement-là, mais pas seulement en pensant que ça se fait par rapport qu'on vient d'un autre pays ou de l'extérieur, mais sur l'ensemble de notre province, puis qu'il y ait des limites mises en place. pour que ça soit légitime et que ça soit que tout le monde ait la possibilité de vraiment être. Moi, si je pose ma candidature, mais j'espère que ça soit considéré non pas par l'argent que j'ai, mais par ce que je peux donner en tant qu'élu municipal ou candidat. Alors, je pense que la loi doit être modifiée dans ce sens-là. On le demande, ça fait un bout de temps, mais on ne l'a pas touché encore. C'est mon commentaire. Merci.
Monsieur Chiasson, vous avez votre main
levée. Oui, c'est ça. Merci, Nadine. Michel, tu as été un petit peu plus vite que moi parce que justement, j'allais discuter de ce point-là. So when it comes to campaign donations, to come back on one of the points that Minister Cardy raised, it is on my checklist. I think it needs to be done, whether it's outside influences trying to sway municipal results or whether it's our citizens here that are trying to sway municipal results. I think we do need a framework around donations. So right now it's a little bit like the Wild West where anything goes. So I think that's in the works, and I think it's going to happen. To come back to his points about maybe foreign interests putting, or original countries putting, pressure on permanent residents, I haven't heard anything. So I have gotten a lot of emails from permanent residents saying that they see this, the fact that we brought a bill forward, they see it as very positive. Je crois aussi qu'il y a une acceptation sociale de la part des gens du Nouveau-Brunswick. Je pense qu'ils sont prêts à justement accorder le droit de vote aux résidents permanents. Donc, il faudrait que je pense que j'ai une bonne discussion avec le Dominic, avec le ministre Cardy pour aller un petit peu plus creux là, dans le fond ce que lui entend par rapport à la pression que les pays mettent sur leurs résidents permanents et si vraiment c'est une menace. Là. Merci.
Ministre Cardy, est-ce que vous vouliez répondre à ça?
Oui, et j'ai hâte d'entrer en conversation avec qui sur le sujet parce que même si on n'en rend pas complètement en accord, je pense que je suis vraiment heureux d'entendre qu'il voit de peut-être inclure dans son projet de loi pour faire la réforme au financement des élections municipales, parce que c'est un peu bizarre que c'est légal dans le Nouveau-Brunswick de prendre un don pour une campagne du Corée-Nord ou n'importe où. Et juste comme tu as mentionné aussi, c'est aussi l'influence qui peut être exigée par les gens avec beaucoup d'argent ici dans la province. Alors ça, c'est vraiment positif. Et sur les autres dossiers, encore, je pense que c'est les questions qu'on a besoin de répondre. Parce qu'on a besoin aussi de prendre comme sérieux le fait qu'il y a les gens qui veulent devenir les Néo-Brunswickois, qui sont ici dans leur territoire, qui veulent être les citoyens et qui ils ont les inquiétudes, comme j'ai précisé. Et peut-être on peut avoir un café et je peux partager. La plupart des lettres, il dit qu'il veut qu'ils restent anonymes, mais je vais enlever tous les noms et on peut au moins regarder le contenu des lettres et je peux assurer que tu es courant avec les inquiétudes qui sont là. Parce que je déteste être dans la position de dire que les inquiétudes envers quelque chose qui va démontrer au monde que le Nouveau-Brunswick est ouvert. Parce qu'on a besoin de devenir encore plus ouvert qu'on n'était jamais. Dans le temps après la pandémie, ça va être le temps pour nous mettre au centre du monde pour dire viens au Nouveau-Brunswick. Mais en même temps, quand j'entends les inquiétudes que j'ai entendues, et quand j'ai eu l'expérience moi-même comme ministre, j'avais le consul de Chine arrivé dans mon bureau sans aucune invitation. Ça, c'est quelque chose qui, dans la plupart des pays, ça serait une violation des normes de protocole assez sévère que quelqu'un va être forcé de partir du pays. Arrivé dans mon bureau pour insister que les programmes qui étaient subventionnés par le gouvernement de Chine vont rester dans les écoles du Nouveau-Brunswick. Alors, s'il fait ça à une ministre, sans aucune consultation avec le premier ministre ou le gouvernement fédéral, il y a les pays dans le monde avec beaucoup de pouvoir qui ne suivent pas les règles. Et on a besoin d'être conscient de ça quand on essaie when we're trying to loosen the rules, we've got to be aware that other people are going to intentionally abuse that. And it's only going to hurt in the long run if we have bad things happen as a result of that, our ability to be open, because it will encourage resentment and questioning of all of the people who make up our immigrant population, who are exactly who we need to attract to our province right now. So my concern is that we might end up by not helping and making things worse at a time when the world is a lot more difficult and stressful than it was a number of years ago.
Alex, I think you wanted to chime in. You had your hand raised.
I did. Thank you. Just a couple of points. I think, Mr. Cardy, your first point regarding there being no evidence that permanent residency may contribute to economic benefits in our province, I guess that's not really surprising because they haven't had votes before. So I think perhaps we're looking at something a little different here. In fact,
they have, Alex. In the 90s, they did.
Was there evidence? Yeah, I guess that's my question. If you say there's no evidence, was there anything looked at there with respect to the potential benefits? That's the first question. The second question relates to the conference call that we did host or have back in January, where this issue was raised very briefly. And at that point in time, I think you had spoken a bit about the potential for some protections that may get over the hurdle or the concerns that you raise. I was very interested at that time to understand what those hurdles were so that we could then determine what protections might be put in place to give us the best of all worlds by accepting permanent residents, giving them the rights, and potentially avoiding the situation where you've talked about influence on municipalities. And I'm wondering if you could speak briefly about that.
Sure. So, I mean, this is, again, me speaking as an MLA, and there's a whole process around government reform. There's Mr. Chiasson's bill, and there's just my perspective on it. But I think if it was something where you had folks who had already undertaken the application for citizenship and that had already begun, at least that's getting much closer to the end of that journey, and they're much closer to having the protections of Canadian citizenship and a Canadian passport. And I would guess that would alleviate the concerns that some of the permanent residents who wrote to me and some citizens who are recently new Canadians that they had raised. So something along those lines might be a way to bridge that gap and reduce some concerns.
If I could just comment on that, though, I think one of the concerns that I did hear in our call back in January is that with the pandemic and with other things happening right now, the delay in going from permanent residency to those that are applying for full resident or full citizenship has become much, much longer. And therefore it creates a situation where we're not getting them any closer to their voting rights.
I mean, it may be longer, but it's still clearly a pathway. And again, we're talking about doing something that would be somewhat exceptional with a number of risks that have sort of laid out that are fairly well documented. So I think that would be an exceptional response. I think if we're looking for trying to come up with a way that more people could feel comfortable with a piece of legislation like this that's already breaking new ground, and for reasons that normally I'd feel very comfortable with this sort of legislation. In this case, doing something to make sure those folks are protected, I think is all the reason to wait a little bit longer and make sure that even if there is a backlog federally, that they had the protection. Because this is ultimately the expressions I'm raising here. These concerns I have about this bill, these came from what I heard from people writing to me saying, "What are you talking about? Please don't do this." So I'm aware of that, and I think they would be not particularly reassured saying, "Well, because there's a federal backlog, we're just going to move ahead." I think it would still offer a much safer process for those folks.
Okay, a bunch of panelists who want to chime in. Alex, I'm sorry, did you want to chime in at any point? I'm just kind of enabling our panelists to answer questions. Are we good? I'm looking at Seb, sorry. I'm going to keep on going. C'est beau? Je continue à prendre les questions des panélistes. C'est beau? Okay, parfait. Dr. Crandall, and then we'll go to Krista, and I see Keith de nouveau. Tu as ta main levée? No? Okay, so Dr. Crandall and then Krista.
Yeah, so, and I don't want to diminish the concerns that have been articulated from constituents, but municipal votes, provincial votes, federal votes in Canada are all secret ballots. So in terms of that influence, there is no way for a government to know how you ultimately vote. And so that concern, I can see, so I'll let you add on to that. And I'll just add that my partner is a permanent resident and has been for some years. And for some permanent residents, they choose not to become Canadian citizens. So I think it is also worthwhile to note that there are people who are here who have made their home here as permanent residents, but for different reasons are choosing not to become Canadian citizens, but who would nonetheless benefit from being able vote because they are as active in the community as anybody else. So I think we have to be aware of the variety of perspectives and stories of permanent residents. And so while some may be concerned about the opportunity, there are many others who would, I think, welcome it and benefit from it. So, so those perspectives, I think it's important to take into account as well.
Thank you, Dr. Crandall. Krista?
Thanks very much. I guess I just had a question for you, Minister Cardy. I wonder if you have a sense of if the members of your caucus are in agreement with your position of not allowing PRs to have voting rights in municipal election, or if they are open to the idea.
Yeah.
So just first on Krista's question, I think there's a range of different perspectives, and some folks are very strongly in favor of the idea. Others have concerns. I've shared mine, obviously, inside the caucus, and will continue to do so. But yeah, so there's again no formal position at this point. And I am not here speaking for the government of New Brunswick or the PC caucus. I'm speaking for myself in my capacity as the member for Fredericton West Hamwell, with a background working on these sort of files and a strong interest in it, and that's it. So it's not. Don't take this as a shooting down of the idea, because again, I think Keith's to be applauded for bringing it forward, and it's good to have these conversations. Even if you take the concerns that I'm raising seriously enough to influence your position, it's still. I think that's still a positive discussion, because often in New Brunswick, I find we forget that we're part of a broader world, and that not everyone treats people the same way we do, good and bad. And on the point made previously by the doctor, I think my concern there is that I'm an immigrant. I was born in the UK, and I still remember taking my citizenship test with my mom at the old court building here in Fredericton, and being very proud of getting my little citizenship card that anyone who is a naturalized citizen has to carry around, and enormously proud of my country and my province. But if someone doesn't want to become a Canadian citizen, I think it is entirely reasonable not to have that person have a voice in the democratic choices of the people who have chosen to make this province and this country their home. So I think it's a more complicated subject, and we start just saying that, well, voting and citizenship, none of this stuff matters very much. These are fundamental questions around identity and belonging and place in the world. And when folks generally like us who are interested in these conversations, and again, I'm finding it odd being on the slightly contrary side in this debate, because usually this is everything that I'm trying to push people on, that there's a whole lot of people who get really uncomfortable when we start treating these things as though these are just throwaways, that citizenship is just, well, who cares? That's what leads to awful populist movements. That's what fired the Trump people when they would go on with the coded messages that only really became apparent how smart they were after the 2016 election about Hillary and her clothes and things like that, making connections to an elite that people felt disconnected from, because we're all comfortable with people from anywhere in the world and love going around the world and are open to new things. Lots of people aren't. And the way we open them up isn't by telling them that the things they value aren't important. It's by walking along and trying to figure out how we bring people to a perspective that's more open. But saying that someone who just comes for economic reasons should have the right to choose our MPs, I don't support that. I think provincially and municipally, there's an argument to be had, which we're having now, with some concerns that I have. The last thing I wanted to say was, because I saw Saif Hassan had written in around saying, how would he be any great threat? It's not about permanent residents being a threat. It's about other people using permanent residents for their own purposes. And this does happen. And it's documented. I'll get you all the links on it, but they're easily available through Google. It's not, this isn't anything that's particularly hidden in terms of information. So it's not about speaking against permanent residents. It's about saying that until you're protected by Canadian law and subject to Canadian law, that there are reasons why we restrict political rights. And there's a reason why this isn't generally very common. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but there's a whole lot of risks that we should really seriously consider, especially because there are countries that are intentionally using openness in Western liberal democracies to undermine them. And if we create a position where permanent residents end up being potentially seen as part of that battle, my concern is that makes life harder for permanent residents, makes the province less attractive to immigrants, and we end up by undercutting what we all want on this call, which is more immigration, because it's better for our province, better for our culture, better for our society, great jobs and all the other great things that immigrants bring.
There are many, like the Q&A is starting. And so Seb, I'm wondering, I know that some panelists wanted to chime in again, but we do have quite a few comments and some questions, and I want to be cognizant of time too.
And
so,
can I interrupt for 1 second? I apologize. I didn't answer one question about how people can find out how people voted. It's very easy. We all have cell phones. You go into the ballot booth and you're told to take a picture and email the picture. And that happens. I've monitored elections in other countries where this is absolutely standard. And there's also a degree that folks, I think it was Janet Mosher wrote in about how lots of new arrivals to New Brunswick are going to come from places that don't have legitimate elections. There's also very often the sense that elections are not free and fair from intimidation. And there's an expectation that government actors will be involved and tell you what to do to an extent. So that's, there's no criticism of anyone involved in that sort of thing, just the reality. Okay.
Thank you for answering that question. So Seb, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yes, I'm reading a lot of the comments. Some of the questions have been answered, kind of. I had oh, did he leave? Probably.
No, I'm just,
you're there.
I'm just plugging in my computer. So I'm just waiting.
Okay, so if there's a new question, please put it in the Q&A. I'm trying to go up. But I had a comment, Minister Cardy. So it wasn't, the influence wasn't coming from the fact that some of these lost votes initiatives were asking for the right to run for office as well. You're talking about, even without that right, which the Fredericton Lost Initiatives was just asking for the right to vote, not the one to run for office, that there was a possibility to influence just the voting. Is that what I understand?
That's
just through the voting?
Yes. I think it would be, I really don't think it would be acceptable to have folks who were not citizens being candidates or representing a place which they don't owe allegiance in the literal sense.
Just wanted to understand that. There are several other countries who have, who do allow this. New Zealand, the EU, some counties in Maryland, several countries in Latin America, including where I'm from, Peru, Venezuela, Bolivia, Chile, Uruguay, even Argentina. And they have a range of requirements, I guess, between 2 to 7 to even more years that they have to be residents until they can even vote in the municipal elections, right? So these regulations run a whole gamut of different requirements as well. Are there any questions there? Not yet. I hear what you're saying. I would like to see that report. But what Dr. Crandall said to add about the benefits that could, benefits for other communities, I'll give you an example. The Japanese community here in Fredericton, out of approximately 20 members here, only 2 of them have renounced their Japanese citizenship to apply for the Canadian one. A lot of them, it means a lot to keep their their connections to their native country. The not being able to hold the dual citizenship is a problem. Even, for example, now in COVID, when they go with their kids and their kids are born here, they won't let the kids in, but they'll let the parents in, right? So for that community, it is, and for other communities as well, India, the Netherlands, I think Ukraine maybe also, but it would mean a lot to them if they could just vote in the local sense, because they wouldn't give up their citizenship to their native country. So that was just to give an example of that. Any questions?
If not, I can respond on that.
Yes.
I think it's, many of the countries you listed don't have dual citizenship, and so it's a way to encourage people to stay and feel a sense of belonging, given that they will never be able to become a full citizen, because there are lots of countries that have citizens based on ethnicity, birth, lots of other requirements that, and they've decided for whatever reasons not to allow dual citizenship. Again, I think that I'd be much more comfortable with a Canada being part of the global push to try and encourage all countries to allow multiple citizenships. I think that moves us in the right direction. And again, absolutely, we should be doing every single thing we can to encourage immigration and to make newcomers to New Brunswick feel welcome from wherever they are in the world. But the extension of political rights, I think, is something that we're treating it as though it's an incentive, and that concerns me. I think we've got to, it's something that's a lot more fundamental than that, and there are serious consequences that go along with it. And I think it's something that we should look at as closely as we can. And that was my concern before getting the communication from citizens in the province about it. But I think those can probably be addressed. The concerns about security and the undue influence against PRs by their home country, that's, again, it's happening, and I'm not sure how we can square that circle.
So would that be, for example, them, the external influence telling them vote for a certain candidate that they think they like, that would benefit?
Yes. I was made aware, because some of the folks who wrote to me on this issue, especially from the Chinese community, had written to me before over the presence of the Confucius Institutes in New Brunswick schools. So it's an example of how a provincial election, in this case, not municipal, but I'm actually working on plans to try and include municipalities more in the governing of our school system. So there would be an overlap there around what courses will be taught and so on. So you have some of these folks who were directly pressured by their government in Beijing to write to MLAs and to oppose the removal of the Confucius Institutes from New Brunswick schools. So these institutes are, again, funded by the Chinese government, and there's a long, lots and lots of stuff online about that if anyone's interested, with real concerns about the institutes being used as vehicles to disseminate Chinese government propaganda, in addition to some good stuff they did on culture and language and dances and things like that. But there was a lot of real concerns from the way that those programs have worked internationally and here in New Brunswick. So when I moved to get rid of them, again, Chinese consul turns up in my office, very bizarre, and the Chinese community in Fredericton was pressured to lobby against it, against those changes. And whether or not they wanted to or not, we're never going to know that, because some of those citizens of China, again, are going to be subject to fairly direct pressure from members of the community here in Fredericton, and potential risks to their families back home. And those potential risks back home, those won't be, to Dr. Crandall's point, those won't be changed by this law, because their families will still be back in China and they'll still be here. But in terms of the direct influence on them and their families here in Canada, there is absolutely a risk. And it's a direct legal risk. Now we see that China, to use the most presently dangerous example, is quite content to arrest and detain and torture the citizens of foreign countries. So there's certainly no qualms at all for them doing it to the citizens of their own countries, when there are 2 or 3 million Chinese Uyghurs in concentration camps.
Okay, Dr. Crandall, yes.
Thank you. Yeah, so first I'd like to acknowledge that, foreign influence in Canadian elections is a reality, is a concern, and this is one that it will continue to be a concern. But in terms of that influence and where it's really going to be situated in terms of will it make an impact in election outcomes, it's really misinformation and disinformation via social media that is the largest threat, or one of the largest threats, and that is not targeted to particular permanent residents, although it can be. I mean,
it is actually.
But it's for all citizens can be targeted, I guess, would be my point. And so we're not talking about taking away voting rights to everyone who may be unduly influenced via a foreign power, via misinformation and disinformation. So we have to acknowledge it as an ongoing challenge, but we also have to find ways as governments to address those challenges, to make sure that elections provincially, nationally are secure. So it's certainly an ongoing issue, but one that is a policy challenge that has to be addressed in all respects. And I just want to open up the conversation a little bit, because I think one of the things that we've been discussing a bit over the last few exchanges is challenges of dual loyalties. Right. So there tends to be a suspicion that it's not just with citizenship, but with so many things, the idea that you cannot perfectly perform your role as a citizen if you also have allegiance to another nation or another country. But this idea, this challenge of dual loyalties is really kind of challenged by the very fact that Canada exists. Firstly, that we're a federation, and nobody questions whether New Brunswickers can function both as citizens of New Brunswick and as citizens of Canada. On a regular basis, we're asked to vote as Canadian citizens in federal elections and as New Brunswickers in New Brunswick elections, and nobody points to a contradiction in having to do those two different votes, where both levels of government have sovereignty over their jurisdictions. And moreover, when we recognize that Indigenous peoples in Canada constitute different nations, we do not question whether or not Indigenous peoples can assert their nationhood and participate as Indigenous peoples while also being Canadian citizens. Right? So in Canada, we have all these examples of dual loyalties and how they function, but because they're all around us, we don't necessarily see them when they're right in front of us. And so the idea of dual loyalties, multiple loyalties, multi-nations within a country has always existed in Canada. And so in Canada in particular, I think it should be easier, not harder, to understand why permanent residents can participate in municipal elections while also having loyalties to their home country. We do it all the time as a federation. And so I think there are lots of reasons why it's not so much of a challenge as it might appear to be.
Yes, Mr. Cardy.
I want to be really clear that I'm not actually questioning the loyalty of the people. I'm questioning the actions of other governments who abuse people. And the reason why issues of multiple loyalties in Canada aren't issues is because I can vote in a provincial election and a federal election without any concern that either of those levels of government are going to come after me in any way. Citizens of China don't have that luxury. And I think it would be an expression of undue privilege on our part to imagine that everyone in the world behaves the way that Canada behaves. We've got lots of flaws. I'm privileged. I was born in the UK and became a Canadian citizen. I still have my British passport. I was really proud to have an EU passport until the citizens of my birth country made a series of stupid decisions, but that's democracy. I'm very confident that the laws of the UK are going to continue to be applied in a reasonably level and even-handed way that's similar to those of Canada, so I don't have many concerns there. If at any point the government of the UK started to behave poorly, I would renounce that citizenship in a heartbeat. And I remember talking years ago with someone saying if I ever ran for federal office, I would renounce my British passport because I think that's appropriate to have a single loyalty to that level of government. We're not talking here about individuals behaving badly. This isn't I want to be very clear on this. The sort of racist rubbish that we heard from the 19th century up until very recently, and unfortunately still often today, and it's now growing again, about the idea that people who come from another place have got loyalties that are suspicious, dangerous, and so on, is wrong-headed, not supported by evidence, and incredibly dangerous to the multicultural society that I'm really proud to be part of. The idea, though, as well, that other countries are not taking advantage of our weaknesses in this area and our level of comfort to just say, well, that talking about Canada versus New Brunswick is the same as talking about New Brunswick versus China. I just don't think that's a fair comparison, because the New Brunswick government is not trying to influence Canadian elections in an undue way using covert means. The New Brunswick government, I promise you this, is not incarcerating people and torturing them in secret prisons. We do not have concentration camps. The Chinese government has all of those things and does all of those things. And they are exacting influence. And so when we're talking about, Doctor, you mentioned around social media campaigns, those are directed through the expatriate community to increase their reach, in addition to the more traditional misinformation mechanisms, just using bot factories and the stuff that we became familiar with listening to stories about Russian efforts to interfere in the US elections. But there is there's an effort here to encourage Chinese Canadians, or people who want to become Chinese Canadians, to post things online, to make statements, to speak out, to use the rights that Canadians have as active political citizens, rights ironically completely unavailable to Chinese citizens living in China, and to use those. So it is definitely a risk. And there's some other things we talked about, some procedural changes. I mean, Mr. Chiasson, if you're willing to look at that, we should have rules against people should not be allowed to bring cell phones into polling stations. You could easily have a box outside and then put them in and pick them up on the way out. That helps with all kinds of different issues with voter security. So absolutely, there are lots of concrete things we can do. But if we'd rushed through with this bill in its initial form, we would have literally just had an election where, in addition to the delays in the election that spooked people, we would have had elections with no limits on funding, no limits on where that funding could come from. The ability to document votes inside polling booths, which again, we'd never think of because no one cares, right? It would be a bizarre thing in New Brunswick for anyone to even do that in the context of just a straight New Brunswick election. But there are things that we can do here, but we've got to make sure that we think about this more than just saying, this is a nice way to show that we're open to the world. We've got to do that as well. We've got to show concrete ways we're open to the world, but I'm concerned that we're looking at this bill as somehow a magic bullet that's going to solve a lot of problems when I think there's some potential good to it, but there are real risks as well. I'm concerned we're not paying attention to.
Emily Chiasson?
Yes, merci Sébastien. So I have to go in 5 minutes. I love the conversation. It's actually very, we've touched on a lot of points. So these will be my closing remarks. So I don't necessarily share all the concerns of Minister Cardy. I do hear what he does say, like he does have some serious concerns about maybe outside influence. I'm sure we could put measures in place to maybe minimize the influence that could come from outside. I think again, it's probably a small group that are might find themselves in a situation where they could be influenced by their original country. I don't see it as a big issue on a large scale. On our part, I think when you're passing a law, and I think maybe this is what happened in other provinces, is when you're trying to find all the answers before you actually put in the law, then the law doesn't go forward, because obviously there's always issues that could arise. And if you're trying to get perfection beforehand, then sometimes things just kind of just don't go forward. So I see this bill as a starting point to maybe reassure Minister Cardy. It doesn't have to be proclaimed right away. We could actually pass the bill, insert it, make sure that permanent residents, the fact that they can vote is actually in the act, and then we could fix a date for proclamation, which means that it would give time to the Attorney General's office or to Elections New Brunswick or to anyone who have concerns to maybe address this. And if there's additional measures that need to be put in place to maybe, like I said, minimize the risk, then let's put them in. But we do need a starting point, and I think it is a good starting point. And I think it would benefit the majority of permanent residents. And so we'll see how things go. I think there's 2 weeks left in the Legislative Assembly. We might bring it back for second reading. And if so, then we'll have a good debate. And I would also encourage maybe to have a free vote in the Legislative Assembly. So that would give everybody a chance to vote their conscience, to vote what they think is the right thing to do instead of having a whip vote. So I'm going to have a talk with my caucus, and then I'm sure they're going to have maybe a coffee with Dominic, and we'll be able to discuss this further. So I want to thank you very much for the invitation, and continue on with the discussion.
Merci Keith pour avoir été avec nous cet après-midi.
Oui, merci.
Très apprécié. Bon week-end.
Weekend, Keith.
Merci.
Seb, should we go to just because we are over time?
Are we? Yes.
Yeah, we're way over time.
I just one more small question. Minister Cardy, so the example that you gave about the Confucius, that's an education matter, that's a provincial, right, a provincial matter. And as we just went through a municipal election and seeing the issues that came up, homelessness, transit, all those things that councillor candidates were talking about, how could a foreign influence seep its way through those local issues, for example? Yeah.
Very concrete examples: procurement and purchasing of certain types of buses, contracting different companies from different countries for municipal infrastructure projects, long list of things like that. So anytime, and we also have in New Brunswick elections to district education council and health authorities as part of the municipal elections. That would be covered under the same law. So you would have the potential influence over the two of the biggest government departments, which have quite a lot of decentralized authority. The health authorities and the district education councils who who are in control of the school districts are responsible for the vast majority of the expenditures of two multi-billion-dollar departments. So these are, so right there with the proposal as it currently is would allow folks who are not Canadian citizens to participate in those votes.
And could you not just limit it to the votes for council and not include the educational boards?
You could, but then again, then you're looking at what happens if there's a procurement fight? What happens if you're dealing with contracts? What happens if you're dealing with sometimes the ceremonial but still important votes? I remember the first thing I was involved with in politics when I was 13 years old was lobbying Mayor Elbridge Wilkins to try and declare Fredericton a nuclear-free zone. And Fredericton was not exactly a nuclear power, and that was purely symbolic, but that was something that was part of a global movement to try and express outrage about nuclear proliferation. Similar votes on issues, for example, invitations for the Dalai Lama to come to a province or to a city, declarations supporting human rights campaigns in many different countries. Those are all things that routinely come before City Hall for votes. And the raising of different flags representing different ceremonial issues. The importance of just that side of politics alone is something which we would start to see become more of a plaything for people who are interested in trying to exert influence. And again, this is stuff that has actually happened. The Toronto School Board is one of the best documented cases in Canada for Chinese direct efforts by the Chinese government to influence a decision. There was the case of a university student union leader who was directly pressured, the Chinese directly pressured Chinese students to harass a ethnically Tibetan student leader. So there's not much respect for government levels here by governments that choose to behave poorly. The point, and they're not going to stop because we approve or don't approve this bill. But my concern again is actually, my concerns are on foreign influence in Canadian politics broadly. That's one question. This bill is about what happens with permanent residents. And my concern is that this bill could actually make life more difficult for some permanent residents. For the vast majority, it would be great. And then it just gets into questions of about appropriate levels of, and when we talk about symbols of citizenship and so on. That's all. Yeah, that's one thing. I don't think that would. That's not what would stop me from supporting this bill. But the possibility again of these folks who've taken the time to write to me to say that first they're afraid to speak publicly, which is depressing when you're talking about people who live in Canada and live in New Brunswick. So we're talking about giving permanent residents more of a voice. In this case, the discussion about giving them more of the voice has actually made them feel less secure. And that wasn't an argument that I had heard before, and this is a perspective that I've been digging into over the last 5 months, the way it could have an impact on them. So if we're talking about making life better for permanent residents, we better figure out ways that we can talk to the ones who actively feel this is a bad thing to the point that they're actually afraid to talk publicly about it. And I'm going to show the letters to Keith so that he knows that I'm not just sitting here making them up. But these are people who've literally said, I do not want to have my name shared. Every one of them said it. Don't want to have my name shared. Please don't pass this information on to anyone. That's it.
And I think the last question, Michel. You're muted. You're muted.
Yes. OK. Non, c'est juste une préoccupation que j'ai sur le commentaire du ministre Cardy concernant l'influence au niveau des achats ou des services qui seront offerts aux municipalités. Et lorsqu'on regarde au processus démocratique, où est-ce que, premièrement, dans une municipalité, c'est la majorité qui fait la force, alors qu'il voudrait dire que ces pays-là auraient de l'influence sur avoir la majorité des membres autour d'une table pour prendre ce genre de décision-là. En plus, le gouvernement, au niveau municipal, nous donne des directives avec des lois qui sont assez sévères et directes en nous permettant d'avoir des achats à certains montants et avoir ces achats-là faits sur une base provinciale, même interprovinciale, mais qui nous empêche d'octroyer de certains contrats à des prix plus élevés que le prix le plus bas. Alors, j'ai un peu de problème lorsqu'on me dit qu'on pourrait avoir de l'influence de l'extérieur pour prendre des décisions au niveau municipal, puis surtout en étant maire, que moi, je n'ai même pas un pouvoir de décisionnel sur mon conseil par la façon qu'on opère en principe, parce que le maire est là comme un leader et mais les conseils décident et la loi nous permet de le faire, que je n'ai pas de droit de vote, il y en a qui ont des droits de vote, mais j'ai un peu de problème avec ce commentaire-là, puis d'utiliser ça comme un argument, alors qu'il voudrait dire que ces pays-là avaient beaucoup d'influence sur beaucoup de personnes qui se présenteraient en politique municipale. Puis en plus, c'est les résidents, les citoyennes et les citoyens qui vont élire ces gens-là. Alors, ça prend toute une dynamique pour que ces gens-là aient accès à un conseil municipal. Alors, j'ai un peu de préoccupation à ce côté-là.
Okay. J'entends les préoccupations. Je vous encourage de lire. Il y a un rapport que j'avais envoyé le lien de nos bureaux d'intelligence, j'ai oublié le mot spécifique du bureau, sur ces questions. Et il précise exactement comme c'est fait et les manières qui sont utilisées. Et quand tu dis que c'est les citoyens et citoyennes qui vont élire les représentatives municipales, si ce projet de loi est adopté, on va ajouter un nombre de personnes qui ne sont pas les citoyens et citoyennes. Alors, toutes les choses que je dis ici, c'est des choses qui arrivent déjà dans le Canada, dans les autres pays démocratiques. Alors, c'est la seule chose qui est nouveau avec notre débat, est-ce que c'est un risque ou des opportunités spécifiques pour les résidents permanents si on étend le droit de vote. Et encore, en commençant ce débat, quelques années passées, j'ai eu des rencontres avec l'équipe qui pousse l'idée. Je dis, OK, c'est une super bonne idée. Pourquoi est-ce qu'on même à l'enlever en 98? Mais encore, le monde a changé dans une manière assez radicale. Et maintenant, il y a les gens qui essaient de nous influencer. Et quand je partage les liens, je vous encourage de les lire parce que je trouve des fois encore que, comme une de mes correspondants a dit, je pense que parce qu'il pense que j'ai dit quelque chose en soutien du projet de loi, même avec les qualifications, il dit, je ne sais pas dans quel monde où est-ce que tu vis. Et j'ai pris ça comme sérieux et j'ai commencé de faire mon recherche et je ne suis pas en désaccord maintenant. Je pense qu'on a juste besoin d'être conscient de ce qu'on essaie de faire et le fait que ce n'est pas aussi simple de simplement offrir un symbole aux nouveaux arrivants. Parce que si ça c'est le cas, je suis là 100%. Mais quand il y a des risques, on a besoin de les analyser, en particulier parce qu'on a besoin dans notre province qui est juste en train, de mon avis, d'ouvrir ses bras et nos bras. Je m'excuse, mon chat est fâché sur le débat. Elle vient de Cambodge. Elle n'aime pas quand je parle en français. Je ne sais pas si c'est l'histoire de colonialisme française en Cambodge, mais chaque fois que je parle en français, elle commence à hurler. Je m'excuse. Mais c'est... je suis complètement perdu mon train de penser. Anyway, so I think we just have to be aware of the risks and think about them. I think the world has changed, and I don't want to make life harder for people who want to make New Brunswick home. I want them to stay. I want them to become citizens and make that as easy as possible.
D'accord. Well, I think we have exhausted already and went way over time. Obviously, it's a great dialogue to have. We could probably continue on if it wasn't at the end of Friday afternoon. I'm impressed that our attendees have stayed with us. So just in closing, so of course, we want to thank all of our panelists that have joined us today. Thank you so much for joining in and enriching this discussion. Thank you again to Sébastien, who has been my sidekick for these last 3 dialogues. It's been wonderful to co-host with you. Merci beaucoup à Yolande Chiasson, notre traductrice, qui a sûrement fait un très beau travail. Merci Yolande. Thank you for all the attendees, of course, for being with us live on Facebook as well as here in the webinar. And maybe a thought that I would leave you with, Minister Cardy, and I would have said this to Monsieur Chiasson as well, but he left, but he's going to see this on recording, is that as you progress along from, political parties, it would be great if we had some form of, ad hoc committee, whatever we want to call it, coalition, comprised of all the people that we have rallied over the last few months, and that could be part of the solution with government. Anyways, I put it out there that if that's something that government is interested in, I think I'm looking at all the faces. I'm sure Alex, Michel, Krista, Dr. Crandall, all these people would be happy to be at the table on an ongoing basis. They all have been punctually, but if there's something that you wish for us to do, dialogue is happy to take the lead and just at least form the committee and get people going. So there'd be consultation. We're able to inform population as well.
Totally, Nadine, and anyone has any thoughts as well, please reach out. I am not here to be hostile on this. I think we need to make sure that we're careful and practice due diligence. And I'll mention to Keith as well if I see him before he sees the video, and see if we can get folks together and keep up the conversation.
Okay, excellent. Merci beaucoup. Thank you. Alors sur ce, bon week-end et bonne continuité. We keep the ball rolling. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Hey.
Merci.